It was a chilly January day in 2019 when something out of the ordinary awakened on Maple Street. The peaceful cadence of the neighborhood was disrupted as six unmarked police cars pulled up to a humble two-story residence in Huntington, West Virginia. Curtains moved. The neighbors stuck their heads out and mouthed words to each other as officers clad in tactical vests quietly moved into position around the house. Inside, David Kowalski, 78, was beginning his day just as he had for almost 5 decades, making his morning coffee. To everyone, he was the embodiment of small-town decency, a retired secondary school educator, a volunteer, a devoted grandfather of four. But at 7:32 a.m., a business-like knock shattering that facade. "Mr. Kowalski," a cop said, "West Virginia State Police, we have an arrest warrant for your involvement in the 1971 murder of Catherine Fitzgerald." Police would come to remember how the old man's hands shook as he placed his mug on the table, yet his face remained unchanging, unnaturally so. It was as if he had been expecting this moment for half a century. Morning sunlight stretched out over the Marshall University satellite campus in Cabell County. Sophomore Patricia Wilson, an education major, pounded on her friend Catherine's dorm room door. "She always met me for breakfast on Tuesdays," she said to detectives later, "when she didn't come to class either. I just knew something was wrong." Campus police were there minutes later and discovered 22-year-old Catherine Fitzgerald unconscious on her dorm room floor. She had been strangled with her own scarf. Her books were open on her desk, notes unfinished, a warm coffee cup. There was no sign of forced entry, no struggle. Only the suddenly and brutally ended life of a bright young woman. For 5 decades, the man who killed Catherine lived mere miles from where he had committed his crime. He attended the same local gatherings where her distraught parents testified about their tragedy. He read anniversary stories in the newspaper about her unsolved murder. He even witnessed Catherine's younger sister become a prosecutor, her own career a product of that one agonizing tragedy. The killer blended in seamlessly. He coached Little League, served on the school board, was even named Citizen of the Year in 1997. He sent Christmas cards, yes, Christmas cards, to detectives who had once suspected him before clearing his name. For half a century, he hid behind the mask of a model citizen, concealing one of the darkest secrets in Cabell County history. How did he get away with justice for so long? What ultimately brought investigators to his front door after decades of false leads? And possibly most chilling of all, how many lives inadvertently crossed paths with a killer living in plain sight? Before we reveal how this predator was ultimately apprehended and the innovative forensic techniques that solved this ice-cold case, take a moment to subscribe and tap that notification bell. Here we delve deeply into true crime tales that other shows only gloss over. Don't miss a single second of this incredible story, a story of deferred but not forsaken justice. Catherine Ann Fitzgerald was born on June 12, 1948, in Charleston, West Virginia, to Elizabeth and Michael Fitzgerald. The first of 3 children, she was to everyone simply Kathy. Her father toiled as a civil engineer for the State Highway Department. Her mother gave piano lessons out of their comfortable house on Kanawha Boulevard. Early on, Kathy was different, considerate, consistent, and reservedly ambitious. In an era when most young women were destined for the classroom, the hospital, or the home, Kathy had bigger aspirations. Her high school yearbook photo was captioned, "Plans to attend Marshall University and become a doctor." That wasn't an easy dream for a working-class girl in West Virginia in the 1960s, but those closest to her say she had the smarts and the compassion to pull it off. She was intelligent, but she never bragged. Her younger sister, Margaret, remembered in a 2015 interview. "If I was having trouble with homework, she wouldn't simply tell me the answer. She'd assist me in determining it." That was Kathy, always instructing, always believing others could do better. Catherine Fitzgerald was valedictorian of Charleston High School's class of 1967. For her family, it was a time of great pride. She would be the first to go to college. In the fall, she joined Marshall University's main campus in Huntington, West Virginia, ready to start the path toward a career in medicine. After 2 solid years there, Catherine moved to the smaller satellite campus in Cabell County to concentrate more intensively on her pre-med curriculum. The classes were smaller, the professors more accessible, just the sort of setting where she would flourish. And flourish she did. By 1971, Catherine was thriving. Her professors admired her discipline and perception, particularly in organic chemistry and biology, topics that made many of her friends groan, but which appeared to invigorate her. She resided in Sycamore Hall, a women's dormitory that housed around 80 women students. Her roommate had pulled out mid-semester because of family problems, so Catherine had a luxury rarely experienced, a room by herself. The Marshall Satellite Campus back then was a peaceful cluster of 5 red brick buildings, tucked against the Appalachian foothills. With just over 120 students, it felt more like a family than an institution, something Catherine cherished after 2 years on the bustling main campus. The small town of Milton, which was located in Cabell County, had a mere 3,000 residents. It was the type of community where individuals greeted each other from the front porch. Doors were seldom locked, and the most serious crime ever committed was typically some children knocking over mailboxes on Halloween. "We had our fair share of internal conflicts and the odd pub brawl," said retired Sheriff Jim Holloway years afterward. "But violent crime? That was just not part of our reality." On campus, Catherine was described as being quietly determined. She was a part-time employee of the university library, a member of pre-med society meetings, and a weekly volunteer at Cabell County Hospital. Her diary, or recovered later from her dorm room, depicted a young woman living with purpose. She was neat, optimistic, and completely committed to the future she was creating. It was like any other Monday to start with. Professors, friends, and her own diary entry that day claim that Catherine went through her routine to the letter. She went to her 8:30 a.m. comparative anatomy class, followed by her advanced chemistry lecture at 11 a.m. At 1:15 p.m. Finally, she had lunch with her best friend Patricia Wilson at the campus cafeteria. "She was perfectly normal," Patricia said later to detectives. "We discussed studying together that weekend. She was concerned about the enzyme portion on our upcoming test. But that was just Kathy being Kathy. She always fretted, even though she'd get the best grade in class." From 2:30 to 5 p.m., Catherine worked her library shift. The head librarian, Doris Malone, recalled her being particularly concentrated that afternoon, rearranging the medical reference shelves and assisting a professor locate some esoteric journal articles. At 5:30 p.m., surveillance footage revealed Catherine entering the dining hall to have dinner. She dined by herself, scanning her notes from plate to plate. She returned to the library at 7:15, when she checked out 2 books from the library and then returned to Sycamore Hall. At 9:20 p.m., she placed her standard Monday evening telephone call home, an activity attested to by phone records and her mother's testimony. She mentioned returning home that weekend, her mother, Elizabeth Fitzgerald, said to police. She wanted to take care of her father's birthday. She sounded so cheerful, planning for the future. At some point before midnight, Catherine penned her last diary entry. "Tired but productive today. Must complete chem problem set prior to Wilson's class. Don't forget to send out Dad's card tomorrow. Summer internship deadline Friday." Review once again. The following morning, Catherine Fitzgerald would be discovered dead. Between those quiet, unobtrusive moments of a diligent student's life and the brutal violence of her murder was a window of approximately 9 hours. 9 hours that would plague detectives for half a century. The specifics of her last day, her routine, her routines, her acquaintances, would prove to be vital clues. They created a picture not only of how Catherine lived, but of who would have wanted to take the life of someone so full of promise. A young woman with no one who disliked her and apparently nothing to conceal. As we continue to dig deeper into this incredible case, I just want to ask you something. Where are you tuned in from today? Whether you're watching from here in West Virginia, where this tragedy occurred, or from somewhere thousands of miles away, true crime has a weird tendency to unite us all. It reminds us of those age-old questions of justice, fate, and why people do the unthinkable. Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to know where our community is tuning in from as we keep peeling back the layers of one of America's most chilling cold cases. It was 9:17 a.m. on March 16, 1971, that campus security officer Robert Gaines made a radio announcement that Cabell County had not heard in more than a decade. 10-31. Possible homicide. Sycamore Hall, room 214. That announcement signaled the official start of what would become West Virginia's longest and most befuddling murder investigation. For Patricia Wilson, the day started with annoyance, the type you experience when a pal stands you up for breakfast. That annoyance was rapidly replaced by concern, and then sheer terror. When Catherine failed to appear for their regular Tuesday breakfast at 7:30 a.m., Patricia assumed she'd just stream of consciousness slept through it. But when 8:45 came, and Catherine had skipped their mutual biology class, something she never did, Patricia's instincts screamed that something was horribly amiss. "I knocked a few times," Patricia would describe in her witness statement later. "Initially normal, then harder." I said her name aloud. The door was locked. That wasn't uncommon. But the silence was. Kathy was always an early riser. Fretting now, Patricia went to locate the resident advisor, 22-year-old Elaine Summers. Elaine had used a master key to open the door after her own knocks were met with no response. "I will never forget Patricia's scream," Elaine testified later. "It wasn't even human." "I glanced over her shoulder and could see Catherine on the ground. I pushed Patricia back, locked the door, and ran for security." Officer Gaines was there in minutes. His report, brief, matter-of-fact, and chilling, reported what he found. Female victim, about 20 to 25 years old, supine on the floor between desk and bed. Ligature marks are evident on the neck. No signs of life. Room not disturbed. Door is locked. Window is closed. Sheriff Thomas Hayward and Detective Frank Mullins arrived on the scene at 9:42 a.m., and 20 minutes later, County Medical Examiner Dr. Howard Levitt followed suit. At 10:30, the previously slumbering Marshall Satellite Campus was teeming with law enforcement officers. News of the murder traveled quickly, striking the close-knit college and tiny town beyond it with shockwaves. Detective Mullins documented his initial impressions in his case notes. Strangled with what turned out to be her own scarf. No sign of forced entry. Room seems clean except around body. 2 coffee mugs on desk, both freshly used. That final touch, the second cup of coffee, would prove to be the most baffling and lingering clue of all. It implied that Catherine had opened the door willingly to her own murderer, maybe even invited them in for a late-night cup of coffee. Whoever did this was not a stranger who broke in. They were someone she knew and trusted. Dr. Levitt's initial investigation put Catherine's time of death between 11:30 p.m. Monday evening and 2:30 a.m. Tuesday morning. She wore jeans and a Marshall University sweatshirt, not pajamas, an indication that she hadn't been getting ready for bed. "The ligature marks show steady, persistent pressure," said Dr. Levitt. "The attacker came up behind her and applied a great deal of force. Within minutes, she would have been dead. The victim probably didn't have much opportunity to defend herself. There were pale bruises on Catherine's forearms and smashed fingernails on her right hand, the sole indications that she had even attempted to resist. Her murderer had been fast, powerful, and eerily accurate. As detectives searched the room, a few facts immediately discounted some motives. Catherine's purse, with $43 still within it, was undisturbed, so it wasn't robbery. Her notes and textbooks sat neatly open on her desk, right next to the 2 coffee cups. It appeared as though she had been studying when someone she trusted knocked on the door, and she let them in. Catherine's door had been locked from the inside, and the key was later found in her pocket. That small but baffling detail stopped investigators in their tracks. "How does that even happen?" Detective Mullins reportedly muttered at the scene. There were only 2 possibilities, and neither made much sense. Either the murderer had their own key, a near impossibility under the university's tight key control system, or locked the door from the inside and used the window to leave. That theory quickly disintegrated, however. The window was not even open, and the fall from the 3rd floor would have been almost impossible to survive without getting hurt or leaving some other trace behind. Short answer: no easy way in, no easy way out. By lunchtime that day, news of the murder had spread far across the campus. Local radio stations interrupted their daytime programming with breaking bulletins. Administrators at the Marshall Satellite Campus convened an emergency meeting and canceled classes for the remainder of the week. "The phones in our office just kept ringing," said Linda Jenkins, a secretary in the administration building. Parents were frantic, insisting they get to take their children home right away. Students were crying in the hallways. It was as if the world had tilted under our feet. The shockwaves did not abate at the campus gates. In Milton's close-knit community, shopkeepers closed early. Churches began to open their doors for spontaneous prayer sessions, and the mayor of the town appeared on local TV that night, calling for calm and assuring that no resource would be left unexpended in apprehending whoever had perpetrated this act. In the meantime, detectives labored deep into the night within Sycamore Hall. They searched every inch of the dorm room for clues, anything that someday would possibly inform them as to who Catherine's middle-of-the-night caller had been. They collected fingerprints from the coffee mugs, carpet fibers, and microscopic skin cells beneath Catherine's fingernails, evidence that 2 decades later would prove to be the solution to the case. "We're handling everything as potential evidence," Sheriff Hayward explained to reporters at a hastily called press conference that night. "We have more questions than answers at this point, but I want to assure the campus and community this case is our #1 priority." By morning of the 17th of March, investigators had set out to construct a timeline of Catherine's last hours, a time-consuming reconstruction from witness accounts, security records, and physical evidence. Timeline of March 15th to 16th, 1971, 7:15 p.m. Catherine borrows 2 books from the library. 7:30 to 8:45 p.m. is observed studying in the common room of her dorm by several students. 8:50 p.m. returns to her room, has a brief conversation with a hallmate. 9:20 p.m. phones home to her parents. Telephone records confirm. 10:15 p.m. Neighbor in the apartment across the hall hears the unmistakable sound of a whistling kettle coming from Catherine's bedroom. 11:05 p.m. Same neighbor hears indistinct voices. No argument, just talking. 11:45 p.m. 2:30 a.m. Approximate time of death, according to the coroner's report. 9:15 a.m. Body is found. The first big challenge of this investigation was determining who had been in that room with her. There was no mention in Catherine's diary of expecting someone to drop by. None of her friends indicated a visit was planned. "The coffee cups told us someone was there," Detective Mullins later said, but nobody would admit to being that someone. Either the killer was a stranger who somehow gained her trust instantly, or someone she knew well, someone who wasn't coming forward. The second issue was the security system in the dorm. Sycamore Hall had rigid visitor policy. All visitors had to check in at the front desk and depart by 10 p.m. sharp. March 15th, logbook revealed no visitors for Catherine, and the night guard attested that no unauthorized individual entered the building after hours. That left detectives with 3 unpalatable options. The murderer was another dorm student. The murderer was an employee of the university who had access privileges, or someone had managed to evade campus security altogether. And then the first concrete lead arrived. The 2 coffee cups, each had residues of the same instant coffee Catherine stored in her dorm room. Whoever consumed that second cup had sat with her voluntarily. Someone familiar, someone whom she trusted. But the surprise was yet to come. When detectives discovered that Catherine's fingerprints were prominently displayed on one of the coffee cups, yet the second one had been wiped clean, they saw something horrifying in this one: deliberate action. That whoever had drunk that coffee was not merely a visitor. They were systematic, deliberate, someone who had planned this. By Friday, March 19th, the investigators had already interviewed 47 individuals: classmates, professors, dorm mates, and campus workers. 23 were fingerprinted, and 15 had hair samples drawn. Everyone had an alibi for where they had been that evening, but not everyone's alibi would hold up to questioning. "The deeper we dig, the more this gets complex," Sheriff Hayward jotted in his notes that weekend. This was not random. This person targeted her, someone close enough to grab coffee late at night, cautious enough to wipe fingerprints, and competent enough to come in and out without leaving a trail. As the body of Catherine was released to her family for burial, the investigation encountered its first genuine wall. No witnesses, no motive, a room of silence and unanswered questions. The Charleston funeral attracted over 400 people. Dozens of her friends had driven the long distance from Cabell County, holding flowers and scraps of paper with written messages. The president of the university eulogized Catherine's brilliance, her empathy, her future that would never come. Her father, stern during much of the ceremony, at last had tears as the casket went into the ground. "We demand justice for our daughter," said her mother, Elizabeth Fitzgerald, her tear-streaked face steady as she spoke to reporters. "Someone out there knows what happened to Catherine. Please come forward." No one did. What no one knew that day was that justice would take half a century to arrive, and that the key clue was already in the possession of the police, locked in an evidence box that would sit for decades, waiting for technology to catch up to a killer who had continued on with life in quiet contentment. By April 1971, the raw shock of Catherine's murder had given way to something more sinister. Fear. Registration at the university satellite campus declined precipitously as concerned parents removed their daughters. Those still present started going out in groups, even in the daytime. The administration raced to install additional lighting and introduce round-the-clock security patrols. Meanwhile, the investigation, once driven by adrenaline, was operating on autopilot. Detective Frank Mullins would not quit. He constructed his investigation outward in what he referred to as 3 circles of suspicion. Individuals who were most intimately involved in Catherine's day-to-day life. Individuals who regularly intersected with her path. Strangers who may have intersected her path by chance. This approach generated a list of 27 potential suspects. "We began with the obvious," Mullins later described. Boyfriends, past boyfriends, male classmates who'd expressed interest, professors with whom she'd spent a lot of time. The first serious target was Thomas Mitchell, Catherine's former boyfriend and graduate student at Marshall's flagship campus in Huntington. He and Catherine had been dating for 8 months until she broke it off that January. Her own diary entries indicated he'd become possessive and resentful of her concentration on medical school. "Classic motive territory," Mullins said. Mitchell was questioned 3 times in a row. He said he'd been working late with friends from class in Huntington that evening, 30 miles away, and his alibi worked. Several witnesses verified it, and phone records indicated he made a call from his dorm at 11:30 p.m., within the approximate time frame of Catherine's murder. Grudgingly, investigators cleared him. Then came the next tip, one that temporarily revived hope. Janet Meadows, a roommate down the hall, said she'd seen a maintenance man exiting the hallway outside Catherine's room at 10:30 that evening. Hours past normal working hours. And again, suspicion fell elsewhere. "He didn't carry any tools with him," Janet Meadows explained to investigators. "I did notice it was strange, but he smiled and said good evening, so I didn't think much of it again." That single point took detectives directly to Raymond Lewis, a 43-year-old maintenance man who had keys to each dorm on the campus. Lewis wasn't a career offender by any means, merely a guy with 2 dusty, disorderly conduct charges from bar fights in his younger days. Yet his access and the timing made him a target of interest. When asked, Lewis's account did not add up. His alibi for that evening was incomplete and full of inconsistencies, enough to make him the #1 suspect for close to 2 weeks. But just as things were getting hot, the whole case against him fell apart. Detectives found hospital records indicating Lewis had been taken into Cabell County Hospital around 9:45 p.m., the night of the killing, with a broken ankle from having fallen off a ladder. He stayed in the hospital through the morning, making it physically impossible for him to have been within even a block of Catherine's dorm. "We don't know who Janet Meadows saw," Sheriff Hayward said at a press conference, but it was not Raymond Lewis. With Lewis out of the way, detectives focused on their next big lead, Professor William Harris, Catherine's chemistry professor. Various students had commented that Harris had shown a special interest in Catherine's schoolwork. He would frequently have her stay after class for extra help, and one student even characterized his conduct as borderline inappropriate. Harris cooperated willingly. He agreed to sit for questioning, submitted fingerprints, and offered an alibi. He had been at home with his wife and 2 teen children the entire evening. His family vouched for it, and his prints matched none taken from Catherine's room. Suspicious or not, there was nothing that could be linked to him by investigators. By the end of April, all 27 names on the initial suspect list had been screened, questioned, and finally cleared. Either due to airtight alibis, forensic contradictions, or sheer lack of evidence. The case had stalled. "We're dealing with either incredible luck or calculated precision," Detective Mullins wrote to Sheriff Hayward on April 30th, 1971. "This wasn't a crime of passion or chance. Someone planned this." Carefully refusing to allow the trail to go cold, detectives broadened their scope. They began canvassing off campus, interviewing the staff at neighborhood cafes, owners of local stores, hospital personnel where Catherine volunteered, even bus drivers who may have had encounters with her on her regular routes. The enlarged search yielded 43 additional names for the expanding suspect list, all rigorously pursued and eventually all cleared. In the meantime, the forensic portion of the case held out little promise. The 1970s weren't the heyday of crime labs. Fingerprinting on the coffee cups employed a basic black powder technique. The clean cup yielded nothing, and the other only Catherine's own prints. The ligature used to suffocate her was examined for stray hairs or fibers, but none were found that resembled any suspect. The only genuine promising lead emerged from the samples of skin under Catherine's fingernails. Evidence she had resisted and clawed at her attacker. Investigators tested every suspect for bruises or scratches on arms, necks, and faces. Nothing. Those small skin samples were preserved and kept. But DNA analysis was still science fiction back then. Something in the future. Our greatest challenge wasn't so much that we were looking for suspects, Sheriff Hayward explained years later, well after his retirement, in a 1996 interview. It was how to protect the evidence. We knew that we had something valuable. We just didn't have the capability yet to utilize it. And back then, maintaining evidence was a delicate process. Paper bags were the norm, not sterile plastic containers like they use now, that tended to cross-contaminate with greater ease. The county didn't have any temperature-controlled storage space, so biological samples would degrade over time. And record-keeping, all handwritten chain of custody forms, often smudged, incomplete, or missing signatures. Despite that, Detective Mullins had insisted that Catherine Fitzgerald's testimony be handled carefully. He could not have realized it at the time, but that action, that dedication to preservation, would become the span of time between 1971 and the truth years later. Detective Mullins did not take any chances with the evidence. He personally supervised each step, the labeling, the packaging, the storage, imposing a level of precision far beyond the norm for 1971. His eye for detail would prove to be a quiet act of genius, one that would be crucial decades down the line. By the summer of that year, though, the case's formerly blazing spotlight started to fade. Local newspapers that had featured daily updates now relegated the case to back pages, and TV reporters turned to brighter headlines. The decreased coverage was a concern to investigators. Without public pressure, they worried witnesses would forget, and important details would evaporate forever. Then in June, there was a glimmer of hope. Margaret Simmons, a retired woman who lived in an apartment overlooking Sycamore Hall, called the sheriff's office with a tip. She said that, at about 1 a.m., the night of the killing, she saw a man crawling out of a dorm window. He was of average height, wearing dark clothes, she remembered. I didn't pay much attention to him. Thought it was probably some kid sneaking out after he'd been to see his girlfriend. But after I'd heard about poor Catherine, well, then I began to wonder. Her narrative fit neatly into the window of time of death, but otherwise there was little for detectives to go on. No face, no distinguishing features, no other witnesses. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood once more, hoping someone else saw something strange that night. Nobody did. By September 1971, half a year since the murder of Catherine, the investigation was on empty. The team had pursued 124 individual leads, questioned more than 200 individuals, and collected 97 items of physical evidence. They'd constructed and discarded theory upon theory, only to find themselves back where they began, with a crime that would not unravel. It was left to Sheriff Thomas Hayward to break the news each detective most fears. The case was to be reclassified as open but inactive. Police talk for cold case. It was the toughest conversation of my life, Hayward would later confess. Michael Fitzgerald just looked at me, eyes vacant. Elizabeth gripped his hand so tight her knuckles turned white. They didn't cry. They didn't scream. They just nodded, like they already knew this was going to happen. Before they departed his office, the Fitzgeralds had one simple, desperate request: keep everything, no matter how tiny. Sheriff Hayward promised, a vow that would span nearly 5 decades, from 1971 to 2019, as those boxes gathered dust in storage, patiently waiting for science to catch up to reality. If you're as on the edge of your seat reading this story as I was researching it, go ahead and click that like button. It helps other people find these overlooked cases too. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? Somewhere out there, Catherine's killer went about his life for nearly 50 years, going to work, celebrating birthdays, checking his watch each day, always wondering if today would be the day his past finally knocked on his door. And in Charleston, the Fitzgerald household was not filled with closure, but casseroles and condolence cards. Elizabeth Fitzgerald, a boisterous piano teacher with 24 students, ceased giving lessons. Michael Fitzgerald took 6 months off from the highway department to come back a quieter, hollowed-out man. The first year was survival, said Catherine's younger sister, Margaret Fitzgerald, in an interview in 2010. Mom would still lay out the table for 4, then just freeze, remembering it needs to be 3. Dad would begin to say, when Kathy comes home for Christmas, and then stop. It wasn't her ghost that haunted us. It was her absence. For the Fitzgeralds, justice wasn't just a cause, it was a legacy. When the police closed the active investigation that September, Michael Fitzgerald started keeping his own meticulous records. Page after page in a series of scuffed leather notebooks, he chronicled everything he could: phone calls, newspaper articles, letters to police, and theories of his own. He was committed that his daughter's tale would never be forgotten, not by the family and not by the world. Michael Fitzgerald documented it all. Each interview with detectives, each hearsay, each newspaper article. No fact was insignificant. When he died in 1994, those records occupied 17 leather-bound books, a father's life work to accomplish something the officials could not: reveal the truth regarding his daughter's death. Elizabeth, on the other hand, channeled her sorrow into action. In 1973, she established West Virginia Families for Justice, an advocacy and support organization for families of murder victims with unsolved cases. What started as 4 bereaved families gathering at the Fitzgeralds' living room expanded to an organization of over 300 members in the 1990s. They weren't merely exchanging grief, they were altering legislation. The Coalition Campaign for Improved Evidence Retention, extended statutes of limitation, and more state funding for cold case investigations throughout the state. My daughter's murderer stole more than her life, Elizabeth testified in 1978, as she lobbied for a bill that would later create West Virginia's first cold case review team. He stole our peace, our trust in the world, our sense of order, but he won't steal our resolve to see justice served, no matter if it takes years or decades. For Catherine's younger sister, Margaret Fitzgerald, the tragedy defined life. She was 16 when Catherine was killed. Destined originally for a life in literature, Margaret deflected course, committed to advocating for victims like her sister. She graduated with a law degree from West Virginia University in 1980 and became an assistant prosecutor in the Kanawha County Prosecutor's Office, where she handled violent crime. Ethical guidelines kept her from personally processing her sister's case, but Margaret ensured Catherine's legacy lived on in her own work. "I couldn't save Catherine," she said to a reporter upon her appointment as an assistant prosecutor, "but I can ensure other families never feel as powerless as we did in Cabell County." Though officially on the books, Catherine's case slipped out of everyday workloads. Nevertheless, there was one man who would not leave it alone: Detective Frank Mullins. Each year, on March 16th, he quietly took the case files out of storage and laid them out on the conference table. It became a ritual. Frank never stopped, recalled former junior detective James Thornton. Every anniversary, he'd go through every photo, every note, every scrap of paper. Sometimes he'd find something small we'd missed. Mostly, though, it was his way of saying, "Catherine, you're not forgotten." The case files themselves traveled quite a distance through the decades. Following the initial investigation, they were transferred from the active case room to basement archives in 1972, and later to a new county records building in 1985. While water flooded the records room in 1997, one deputy allegedly carried the Fitzgerald evidence boxes to high ground on his shoulders, and no one else was allowed to touch them. The case never really faded from public memory. It came back to life every few years, particularly on anniversaries. 1976, 5-year anniversary. The Huntington Herald-Dispatch ran a week-long series called Justice Delayed, The Catherine Fitzgerald Mystery. 1981, 10-year anniversary. A Charleston television station created the first documentary on the case and included interviews with investigators and the Fitzgerald family. 1991, 20th anniversary. The student newspaper at Marshall University published a look back that, unfortunately, contained several inaccuracies, prompting Elizabeth Fitzgerald to fire off an acerbic letter to the editor. "This is not folklore," she wrote. "This is our continuing nightmare." And then 1996 arrived, the 25th anniversary, along with a renewed glimmer of hope. DNA testing was proving to be a revolutionary aid to criminal investigations, and for the first time in years, it seemed that science was going to possibly succeed where witness recollection and good old-fashioned police work had faltered. Sheriff William Donovan, a rookie deputy himself back in 1971, signed off on the first official cold case review of the Catherine Fitzgerald murder. It had been a quarter of a century, but thanks to Mullins's careful preservation, the evidence was still there, waiting to be heard. A special cold case unit of 4 people was convened in 1996 to reopen the case of Catherine Fitzgerald's murder. They reviewed all photographs, all the fingerprint cards, all the statements ever obtained for 6 weeks. They also found the surviving witnesses and re-interviewed them, some of whom had not been asked questions for more than 20 years. Their efforts did not lead to an arrest, but did achieve something of the utmost importance: preservation of the evidence in a form that would be good for future analysis. "The fingernail skin samples were our best biological evidence," said forensic technician Sandra Morris, who supervised the repackaging process. "In 1971, they were placed in a paper envelope. We moved them into sterile containers and we put them in the refrigerator. If there was any DNA left, we wanted to provide it with its very best hope of survival." 2 years passed before, in 1998, Catherine's evidence was subjected to its first ever DNA analysis. Again, the technology was primitive, and the tests devoured much of the precious material without yielding definitive results. The result was heartbreaking. Years of conservation had all but been reversed in one early failure. "We were ahead of the science," admitted Sheriff William Donovan during a press conference, "but we've protected what's left. This case will be solved. It's only a matter of when technology catches up to our determination." As the investigation cycled between renewed hope and painful setbacks, Cabell County itself evolved dramatically. The Marshall Satellite Campus, where Catherine attended school, expanded into a complete regional hub before being absorbed back into the main university system in 1989. Sycamore Hall, the residence hall where she was murdered, remained until 2001, when it was torn down to be replaced by a new student housing complex. The demolition stirred limited public interest for a moment as news teams revisited the decades-long enigma one last time. The surrounding town of Milton also changed, from a peaceful rural town of 3,000 in the 1970s to a suburban extension of Huntington with close to 10,000 inhabitants by 2010. Fewer and fewer of the newer residents had even heard of the Fitzgerald case, although for older residents, it was still an open wound to community memory. To keep that memory alive, local schools started teaching the Fitzgerald case in West Virginia history class so that generations to come would be aware of the tale behind the reforms that molded their state's judicial system. The legacy of the case extended far beyond schoolrooms. It transformed how law enforcement treated evidence itself. "Prior to Fitzgerald, we handled evidence as if it had to just survive until trial," recollected Police Academy instructor Robert Jenkins in 2005. "After Fitzgerald, we treated it like it could possibly be used to speak for the victim in 50 years. That change in perspective," he said, "cracked open dozens of cold cases statewide. The ripple effects also extended onto college campuses. In 1972, immediately after Catherine's murder, the West Virginia State Board of Education imposed sweeping new campus security requirements, including electronic key systems, visitor registration logs, and 24-hour dorm security staff. These actions were pioneering at the time and would later serve as a national model for campus security. By 2001, the 30th anniversary of Catherine's death, the case had been officially reopened 5 times, each time incorporating the latest forensic technology: fingerprint computer databases, microscopic fiber analysis, and state-of-the-art statement analysis techniques. But by the 40th anniversary in 2011, the attitude was different. What had previously been discussed as a tractable enigma was now viewed by many as a tragedy likely to go unsolved. That year, the Herald-Dispatch ran a front-page feature titled, "4 Decades Later, Has Justice for Catherine Fitzgerald Become Impossible?" Elizabeth Fitzgerald, then 84 years old and in frail health, gave what many believed would be her final interview. Still resolute, still sharp, she refused to let her daughter fade into history. "I've resigned myself to the possibility that I won't live long enough to see Catherine's murderer be punished," Elizabeth Fitzgerald said quietly to the reporter. "But I think that day will arrive." Science makes progress. Consciences get heavier with age. Secrets have a tendency to leak out. Someone knows something, and one day that information will surface. Something Elizabeth couldn't possibly know was that the breakthrough she longed for was already stirring to life, beneath the radar, in labs and databases nationwide. In 2012, the FBI introduced a significant enhancement to its Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, increasing the amount of genetic markers employed in profiling from 13 to 20. By doing so, it singly increased the system's capability to recognize matches, taking old, incomplete samples and converting them into possible keys for long-standing cases. 1 year later, in 2013, American investigators made history when they employed familial DNA searching for the very first time to identify a suspect based on the genetic profile of one of his relatives. And then came 2018, the year everything changed. That spring, the capture of the Golden State Killer, a suspect with crimes dating back to the 1970s, revealed to the world the breathtaking power of genetic genealogy, a new technique that paired commercial DNA databases with forensic analysis. Cold cases, long considered unsolvable, were being reopened nationwide overnight. In Cabell County, Detective Sarah Keller observed these events of close interest. She had assumed the case file of Fitzgerald in 2015, inheriting not only the dusty boxes of evidence, but almost 5 decades of hope and sorrow. Keller was a patient woman, half detective, half historian. It took her 3 years, but she meticulously digitized each record, copied each report, and documented every scrap of physical evidence. What she produced was the first full electronic archive of the Fitzgerald probe. "The Fitzgerald case has never had a shortage of evidence," she wrote in a 2018 internal memo to her department. "The issue has always been we couldn't connect that evidence to a single individual. The same kind of genetic genealogy that identified the Golden State Killer could finally bring justice for Catherine." Her request for funding was granted in January of 2019. That moment discreetly initiated the last act of a narrative that had started almost half a century before. With the evidence being packaged for export to a private laboratory, no one could have anticipated how quickly the truth would emerge, or how stunning it would be. For Elizabeth Fitzgerald, who had borne her daughter's memory with her through 48 long years, the timing would be both poignant and heartbreaking. The woman who had started an advocacy group, lobbied legislators, and kept Catherine's name in the public eye would finally get the one thing she had waited so long for: answers. On February 12, 2019, Detective Sarah Keller stood at her evidence table, sealing a small, carefully labeled package. Inside were the skin samples taken from beneath Catherine Fitzgerald's fingernails, a paperback-sized parcel handled with the reverence of something holy. "I remember thinking, this is it," Keller later said. "Either this works, or we finally have to accept that Catherine's case might never be solved." The package was shipped to Virginia-based Parabon Nanolabs, a renowned forensic laboratory on the cutting edge of genetic genealogy in the aid of law enforcement. This new detective technique had been born out of an unlikely fusion: consumer ancestry testing massive data analysis, and good old-fashioned shoe-leather detective work. While conventional DNA testing relies on identifying a direct match within a criminal database, genetic genealogy might chase a suspect through distant relatives. Individuals who had posted their DNA voluntarily on genealogy websites to discover more about where they came from. The method had already solved dozens of cold cases since 2018, some over half a century old. Regular DNA testing is like looking for someone by searching only their precise address, said Dr. Eleanor Wright, the forensic genetic genealogist who worked on Catherine's case. Genetic genealogy, though, it's like canvassing the whole neighborhood. Genetic genealogy, Dr. Wright said, is like finding a person by following their cousins, then mapping where they have to be based on those cousin connections. It doesn't just expand the search, it blows the doors off it. The work started with a daunting challenge: extracting viable DNA from the skin samples that had been stored since 1971. Almost 5 decades had gone by, and despite the diligence exercised by generations of custodians, time had caught up. We recovered about 0.4 nanograms of highly degraded DNA, Dr. Wright wrote in her initial report. In normal circumstances, that wouldn't be sufficient for examination. But science had caught up with the case of Catherine Fitzgerald. With advances in whole genome amplification, the laboratory was able to produce millions of copies of those minute fragments, enough to build a viable DNA profile. Unlike typical forensic testing, which is limited to comparing only 20 genetic markers, this procedure compared hundreds of thousands, constructing a much more vivid genetic portrait. The larger profile was then cross-checked with public DNA databases, those where individuals had given permission to law enforcement to use. The first search did not produce a direct match, but it did find 17 individuals who were as close as third or fourth cousins to having that much DNA in common with the unidentified killer. These weren't close relatives like siblings or children, Dr. Wright explained. They were distant cousins, people who probably never met the perpetrator, but shared great-great-grandparents somewhere up the family tree. From those faint connections, Dr. Wright's team began the genealogical deep dive. Using census data, birth and marriage certificates, newspaper archives, and public records, they started reconstructing family trees, branch by branch, decade by decade. It's like putting together a 2,000-piece puzzle when you don't even know what the end picture is, Wright groaned. We were basically charting out the killer's family tree without yet knowing who the killer was. The family trees expanded by late March 2019 to more than 2,400 individuals in 7 generations. The next task was to narrow the pool. They used filters based on what detectives already had. The suspect was male, probably between the ages of 18 and 40 in 1971, and had some association with Cabell County, West Virginia. That narrowed it down to 38 men. Then after cross-checking the names against job records, home addresses, and school lists from that time, the team narrowed the list further, to only 7 men who met all the criteria. Detective Sarah Keller was given the list on April 2nd, 2019. When I opened that email, she said later, I thought I was going to see a list of names that I had never seen before. But then I looked at it, names that I had seen in the case files previously, and one of them really chilled me to the bone. Number 3 on the list, David Kowalski, age 78, and a current resident of Huntington, West Virginia. A rummage through the digitized 1971 archives found his name immediately. Kowalski had not been considered a suspect at the time, only a witness. He was then a 30-year-old high school teacher of chemistry who periodically guest taught at the Marshall Satellite Campus, where Catherine was a student. He told police that he tutored Catherine in higher-level chemistry, but their interactions were strictly professional. He claimed to have seen her 2 weeks prior to her murder and said he'd been at home with his wife the night she was killed, an alibi that had been valid when he gave it. With no motive, no physical evidence, and no basis for suspicion, detectives in 1971 just moved on. What struck me, Keller said, was how unimportant he seemed in the original investigation. Just another name from a routine round of faculty interviews, his name appeared just twice in more than 2,000 pages of case notes. Barely a blip on the radar in 1971. Yet now, nearly half a century later, he was the key to everything. Prior to questioning David Kowalski in person, Detective Sarah Keller required definitive proof that the genetic match was not a fluke. But requesting a DNA sample from him would reveal her hand. So she resorted to a technique now standard in genetic genealogy investigations: surreptitious collection of shed DNA. For 3 days, a small surveillance detail tracked Kowalski through his routine Huntington days. They saw him go grocery shopping, work in his garden, and visit the same corner cafe each morning for coffee. Finally, on the third day, he discarded his paper cup in a receptacle by the door. Within minutes, an undercover officer picked it up and took it to the West Virginia State Crime Laboratory. Technicians swabbed the rim for saliva, extracted a DNA profile, and compared it to the genetic material taken from beneath Catherine Fitzgerald's fingernails in 1971. The results arrived on April 7, 2019. The match probability, 99.9998%. I remember just staring at that report, Keller later said quietly. It was this strange mix of elation and horror. Elation because we'd finally found him. Horror because of who he was. What investigators found next made the case even more chilling. David Kowalski wasn't a recluse, a drifter, or a criminal. He was, by all outward appearances, a pillar of Cabell County society. Following a dozen years as a high school chemistry teacher, he came to the faculty at Marshall University in 1983 and worked his way up to become head of the chemistry department before retiring in 2009. He'd also spent 3 terms on the Milton City Council during the 90s, coached young people's soccer for almost 2 decades, and had even received the local Rotary Club's Citizen of the Year award in 1997. He was the last man anyone might have suspected, and perhaps that was precisely why no one did. But the most disturbing revelation wasn't that of his resume. It was that of his proximity to the Kowalski had gone to Catherine's funeral all those years ago in 1971. He'd given low-key, regular contributions to the Catherine Kowalski Memorial Scholarship Fund, and in 1985, he'd even participated on a state task force for campus security, along with Elizabeth Fitzgerald herself, Catherine's mother. He gazed that mourning woman in the eye, Keller said, year after year, with the secret of her daughter's murder. That's not only deception, that's psychological theater. Forensic psychologist Dr. Ela Cassidy, who was consulted for the final review, stated more directly, "This wasn't a man hiding from guilt. It was a man who learned how to survive with it, who constructed a whole life on the foundation of a deception. He didn't disappear into the dark. He became a part of the light." With the DNA match confirmed, Detective Keller and her team started plotting the arrest. It would have to be carried out carefully, not only because Kowalski was 78 years old and highly respected, but also because once the news hit, it would shake the whole community to its core. Dawn rose cold and pale over Huntington on the morning of January 15, 2019. 6 unmarked cars drove quietly up a neat suburban street and ringed a humble 2-story house where David Kowalski had lived for over 40 years. No one uttered a word as Keller reached the front door. As soon as it swung open, each officer present later remembered the same thing: the expression on his face. It wasn't shock, it wasn't fear, it was acknowledgement. He appeared to realize that this moment had been pursuing him for years, and finally had caught up with him. Kowalski didn't resist when he was read his rights, handcuffed, and taken toward an awaiting car. His wife, white-faced and shaking, stood in the doorway. He came back to her and said only one thing: "Call Attorney Simmons. Tell him it's about the Fitzgerald girl." News of David Kowalski's arrest ripped through Cabell County like a shockwave. By midday, every local news outlet had the story splashed across their front pages and airwaves. Neighbors stood frozen on porches, watching live coverage, unable to process what they were hearing. How could Dr. K, the gentle, soft-spoken chemistry professor, also be a killer? Old students, classmates, even close buddies were trying to understand. "It can't be Dr. K," said a former student, Jason Reynolds, on a live interview. "He was the nicest man I have ever met. He even wrote my college recommendation letter. He attended my wedding." But still, the DNA evidence was conclusive. The man that so many had looked up to had led a dual existence, And the reality of that evening in March 1971 was finally taking shape. David Kowalski was then 30 years old, a smart, driven high school chemistry teacher, recently married to his wife, Diane. He had ambitions of becoming a member of the Marshall University staff and frequently tutored college students for extra money. According to all reports, he was well-spoken, responsible, and respected by students and colleagues alike. But beneath the professional veneer was a mounting fixation. Kowalski learned to become obsessed with Catherine Fitzgerald, a student he had met at a university lecture series. When detectives reread Catherine's diary after Kowalski was arrested, they discovered harmless references to Mr. K assisting her with chemistry principles. Entries that probably seemed insignificant then. But to Kowalski, those interactions held a different meaning. Kowalski came to Catherine's dorm room that evening, posing as a discussion of an exam, said Detective Keller at a news conference. 2 cups of coffee indicate she regarded him as a trusted counselor. Something, most likely a spurning of unwanted advances, provoked his outburst of violence. Once he had strangled Catherine, Kowalski showed sinister deliberateness. He wiped down every surface he had made contact with, removed the second coffee cup with him, which was never seen again, and escaped during a shift change in the dormitory security when the front door of the dorm was briefly unsupervised. When he arrived home, his wife, who was sleeping on sedatives, had no recollection of when he had gone to bed. But maybe the most chilling aspect of this tale isn't the killing itself. It's what Kowalski did afterward. Rather than vanish or act guilty, he doubled down on his regular life. He didn't merely cover, let alone he reinvented himself. Kowalski's deception was extraordinary, said Dr. Ela Cassidy, the forensic psychologist who later reviewed the case. He didn't retreat into shadows. He built an entirely new identity, someone trustworthy, even admirable. It's one of the most calculated psychological transformations I've seen. In the years after Catherine's death, Kowalski's life thrived. He completed his PhD in chemistry through night classes, secured a position at Marshall University in 1983, and rose to become department chair. He published respected research papers, mentored students, won teaching awards, and was seen as a role model in both academia and the community. His civic history looked like a good citizen's resume: youth athletic league coach, city councilor, church deacon, charity volunteer. But his closeness to the very crime he had committed is what sent shivers down investigators' spines. He never broke away from Catherine's case. He visited her memorial services on anniversary milestones. He spoke to local media, commenting on the tragedy and calling for community awareness. In 1991, he even participated on a panel regarding campus safety upgrades, a discussion sparked by the murder he had committed himself. "He didn't just get away with murder," said Margaret Fitzgerald, Catherine's younger sister, after the arrest. "He used my sister's death to build his own reputation." That kind of cruelty, it's almost harder to understand than the act itself. Searches of David Kowalski's home following his arrest unearthed chilling confirmation of what investigators had long suspected. His connection to Catherine Fitzgerald's murder had never truly left his mind. Hidden behind a false panel in the basement workshop of his home, detectives discovered a tiny wooden box wrapped in an old towel. Inside was what seemed to be Catherine's missing coffee cup from her dorm room, meticulously preserved, still wrapped in a handkerchief. Next to it was a stash of newspaper articles dating almost half a century, each tucked away in acid-free sleeves and organized in chronological order. He stored trophies, Detective Keller later noted, not displayed but concealed. It tells us he replayed the crime in his head, again and again, for years. It wasn't something he forgot. It was something he lived with. As the news unfolded, Cabell County was in an ethical and emotional spin cycle. How could the man who shoveled his neighbors' driveways, tutored failing students, and organized church charity drives also be the same man who had taken a young woman's life with cold, calculated murder? "The toughest thing for a lot of people to swallow," said Mayor Robert Jenkins, who had served with Kowalski years ago on the city council, "is that both sides of this man are true. The mentor and the killer lived in the same body. Our community is grappling with that paradox. And now, as this tale comes out in all its nuance, I'd like to stop for just a moment. What's the weather like where you're at today? It's an easy question, but one which reminds us, though we're linked together by this story, each of us is experiencing it from various locations. Just as Cabell County residents each brought their own iteration of who they thought David Kowalski was. The Cabell County Courthouse had never witnessed anything on the order of what congregated outside for Kowalski's arraignment on the 17th of January, 2019. Grills of satellite vans covered the courthouse lawn Thursday afternoon. National journalists pushed against local reporters. Cameras popped from all sides as the 78-year-old former educator was ushered inside. The tale had expanded far beyond a local tragedy. It was a national story, a tale of justice delayed but not denied. In the courtroom, David Kowalski looked frail and shrunk. The cocky professor in tweed blazers was gone. Instead stood a retired man in an orange jumpsuit, his wrists cuffed, his formerly commanding stride replaced by a slow, deliberate shuffle. And yet, even diminished thus, his eyes remained keen, sweeping the room with quiet calculation. The same calculating gaze once applied to grading lab reports and walking students through complicated formulas. When proceedings began, Judge Martha Simmons, a former student of Kowalski's, immediately recused herself. "The integrity of these proceedings must be beyond question," she stated firmly, transferring the case to Judge William Harmon from neighboring Wayne County. Kowalski pleaded not guilty, though few were in any doubt about the direction the case would take. Within a matter of days, his lawyer, Thomas Simmons, started private negotiations with prosecutors for a potential plea deal. Talks that stepped up speed once a second independent DNA test supported the match with Catherine Fitzgerald. Cabell County's shared bereavement, meanwhile, transformed into something more profound and fraught. Others held on to denial, unable to accept the man they'd trusted for so long could be capable of murder. Others seethed in outrage at the deception, feeling their trust in community and character had been destroyed. Two spontaneous memorials sprang up overnight, bouquets and candles placed at the site of Catherine's former dormitory. Handwritten notes and angry messages taped to the doors of the Marshall University Chemistry Building that still bore Kowalski's name on a donor plaque. The university moved quickly. His name was removed from the annual chemistry scholarship he'd funded, and in its place, a new fellowship was established to honor Catherine Fitzgerald's memory. The Milton City Council voted to revoke his 1997 Citizen of the Year award by a unanimous vote. Former colleagues released statements that ranged from shock to regret to disbelief. "We're all questioning everything now," said Dr. Robert Chen, who is today the Marshall Department Chair of Chemistry. "How many students did we send to his office hours alone? How many young women over all those years approached David Kowalski for guidance, assuming his integrity, trusting his word?" The deceit went far beyond Catherine Fitzgerald. It radiated through a lifetime of students, neighbors, and co-workers who had no clue that the man they respected possessed a dark, unspeakable secret. For the Fitzgerald family, the arrest of Kowalski had caused a complicated mix of feelings: relief, shock, and a profound, silent sadness at all that had been lost. When Detective Sarah Keller went personally to tell Elizabeth Fitzgerald, now 92 and residing in assisted care, about the arrest, the elderly woman merely nodded. "I knew I would live to see this day," she said matter-of-factly. No tears, no victory, only quiet conviction from a woman whose faith in the law had never faltered. Her daughter, Margaret Fitzgerald, now 64 and recently retired from a law career, emerged as the public voice of the family. Facing cameras at a press conference following the arraignment, she spoke with the calm precision of a lifetime spent in courtrooms. "For 48 years, we've existed in a void," she started. "The void of Catherine and the void of answers. Today, half of that void is filled. We know now who stole Catherine from us, but the larger void is still there, and no arrest and no conviction will bring back the decades of life my sister and our family were robbed of." When a journalist questioned her about how she felt about Kowalski, Margaret's voice broke for the first time. "I sat across from him at community gatherings. I thanked him once for giving to Catherine's scholarship fund. The maliciousness of his deception, the way he wore that mask with such ease, is almost more difficult to accept than the killing itself." How to say on March 15, 2019, 48 years to the day since the murder of Catherine, David Kowalski accepted a plea bargain. He also pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, sparing the community the expense and pain of a lengthy trial. Prosecutors, in return, promised not to pursue separate charges for tampering with evidence and obstruction of justice, charges which could have delayed the legal fight by years. His sentencing on April 30th attracted a gigantic crowd. The courthouse opened 2 overflow rooms with live video feeds to hold the crowd. Former students, professors, neighbors, and dozens of cold case detectives who had come from across the country to see the end of a case that had haunted their profession for nearly half a century. Judge Harmon started by inviting impact statements from the Fitzgerald family. Michael Fitzgerald Jr., Catherine's nephew, named in part after the aunt he never knew, spoke first, recounting the inheritance of sorrow that had passed down through his family in the form of a shadow. Then Margaret read from her mother's words. Elizabeth was too weak to be there, but her words were possibly the most forceful voice in the room. To the man who kidnapped my daughter, you took not just Catherine's future, but fragments of everyone who cherished her. For 48 years I have borne her loss while you enjoyed freedom and respect. I do not despise you. Despising you would deprive me of more than you have already taken. What I feel for you is pity that the void within you permitted such inhumanity to coexist with such appearance of kindness. When given the opportunity to talk, Kowalski rose slowly, his glasses adjusted in that same movement so many of the past students remembered, a gesture now forever sullied by what they understood. I have no defense or excuse to give, he said softly. I have lived 2 existences, one that everyone could see, the other only I know. I cannot take back what I did to Catherine Fitzgerald. I can only admit it now, at the end of my life, when it comes much too late to do anything for anyone but historians of this case. Judge Harmon sentenced him to life in prison without parole, the maximum penalty allowed. At 78 years old and in declining health, everyone understood what that meant. He would die behind bars. As deputies escorted him from the courtroom, Kowalski turned his head briefly toward the Fitzgerald family, his eyes meeting Margaret's for a fleeting moment before he disappeared through a side door. In the subsequent months, Catherine Fitzgerald's case evolved from an open case to a training module on justice. The FBI incorporated it into their training materials, demonstrating the ways in which genetic genealogy could bring new life to even the most cold of cold cases. Forensic science courses taught it as a case study in evidence preservation and advancements in DNA technology. Police forces across the country reopened old files with renewed optimism. In Cabell County, the tale was made a moral mirror. The university launched an Ethics and Responsibility Center, which spent much time examining integrity in professional life. Local schools incorporated a curriculum unit on the case, educating not only the science that cracked it, but the human price of dishonesty and the persistence of truth. The site of the dormitory where Catherine's life was lost was converted into a memorial garden, a peaceful haven abounding in perennial flowers, a living testament to memory and strength. Catherine Fitzgerald's memory expanded far beyond her own untimely demise. It endured in the medical advancements her case initiated, the advocacy group her mother established, the legal practice her sister followed, and the families that ultimately discovered justice through the same methods that provided closure to hers. On the first anniversary of Kowalski's sentencing, Elizabeth Fitzgerald passed away peacefully in her sleep. Her obituary, written by Margaret, ended with a single line that said it all. She died having witnessed the justice she sought for nearly 5 decades, her life's mission complete. If stories like this move you, consider subscribing to the channel. Every week we delve into how cutting-edge science and tireless sleuths are closing the door on decades of enigmas, one DNA strand, one determined heart at a time.